Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're looking at one of the most famous monuments in the world, the Colosseum in Rome. If you've ever seen it, you'll know that it doesn't look complete. Whole sections of the outer wall are gone, and much of the stone has disappeared. But what happened to it? Was it destroyed by war, by earthquakes, or by the hands of the very people who once built it? The Colosseum was a symbol of Rome's power, a marvel of engineering, and a building that survived long after the empire itself fell. Over the centuries, it was shaken by natural disasters, stripped of its marble, and recycled into churches, palaces, and even houses. What we see today is only a fraction of what once stood, but its story is as rich and layered as Rome itself. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're winding down for the night or simply curious about the past, I'm glad you're here. Now, let's begin. Rome, in the year of Vespasian, was a city in need of a new beginning. Nero had taken his pleasure in the center of the urban landscape with a palace complex that seemed to mock the people who lived beyond its walls. The Domus Aurea stretched like a private kingdom across the valley between the Palatine, the Esquiline, and the Caelian, complete with an artificial lake that glittered where earlier generations had walked and traded. When Vespasian emerged from civil war and took the purple, he understood that a durable reign required the steady language of public works. He would return the heart of the city to the people. He would drain the lake, break the spell of Nero's private fantasy, and raise a public amphitheater of a size and dignity befitting Rome. The choice of site was brilliant politics and sound engineering. The low ground where Nero's lake had sat offered space enough for an oval mass that would command the valley and be seen from the hills around it. To build there meant first to erase the lake and to tame water. Roman surveyors measured gradients with chorobates and groma, and then tied the drained basin into the city's ancient sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, so that seasonal rains would be carried away. Only when the marshy soil had been stabilized with layers of rubble and compacted fill could the builders pour the continuous ring foundation that would hold the structure for centuries. The Romans called their concrete opus Caementicium. Mixed with pozzolanic ash, it hardened even in damp conditions and bonded stone into a single organism. That ring foundation, set carefully within the old lakebed, became the amphitheater's buried spine. The superstructure rose in courses that married strength and elegance. From the travertine quarries at Tiber, carts and sledges hauled pale blocks along the Via Tiburtina. Each block was squared and clamped to its neighbor with iron dogs set in lead, a practical hedge against corrosion and a way to distribute stress through a living frame of masonry. The outer shell took shape with 4 stories. At ground level, arcades rested on heavy piers articulated by engaged columns in the robust order Romans called Tuscan. Above them, a second ring of arches displayed the Ionic order, and above that another ring supported the Corinthian. The attic story at the top replaced arches with a screen of pilasters and deep windows, pierced at intervals by sockets where wooden masts would later be stepped to carry the great awning that shaded the crowd. Inside, the form of the Colosseum was anatomy and choreography at once. Radial walls ran from the elliptical outer ring to the inner retaining wall that circled the arena. Between those walls, a honeycomb of stairways, corridors, and landings arranged the audience by rank and made movement reliable and fast. The Romans called the exit passages vomitoria because they could empty a section of seats in minutes. There were 80 numbered entrances around the circumference. 76 served the general public. One axial gate on the north received processions. Another on the south became the gate through which the dead would be carried later in the arena's working life. The remaining 2 were reserved for the emperor and the Vestal Virgins. It was an architecture that taught order without speaking a word. The measurements themselves tell a story of careful proportion. The outer ellipse stretched a little under 200 meters on the long axis and more than 150 on the short. The arena within, defined by a tall parapet, measured roughly half that length. The seating rose in carefully graded tiers called Myniana. At the podium nearest the sand sat senators and magistrates on marble benches. Above them, the equestrian order filled their section. Ordinary citizens, segregated further by status and occasionally by guild or neighborhood, occupied the higher rings. At the very top, beneath the forest of masts that would support the awning, a wooden gallery accommodated the poorest Romans and many women. The arrangement was unmistakable. The social body of Rome was mapped into stone and concrete. This immense machine was paid for by war and sustained by labor on a scale that is difficult to picture. Spoils from the Judean campaign and the sack of the temple in Jerusalem flowed into the treasury and underwrote the works. Ancient writers speak of prisoners among the laboring force, and there is little reason to doubt that skilled and unskilled hands from across the empire worked the quarries, cut timber, mixed mortar, and set stone. Engineers directed teams with capstans and treadwheel cranes. Masons finished joints so carefully that light could not pass between the blocks. Carvers prepared marble revetments that would later dress interior walls and stairheads. Bronze workers fashioned monumental shields and inscriptions. What emerged was not only an entertainment building, but also a durable declaration of imperial capacity. Even in this early phase, the amphitheater was an urban project as much as an isolated monument. New streets braided around it. Vendors prepared to occupy the arcades of the podium and the external ring when the games began. Aqueduct branches were surveyed to ensure water for cleaning and for whatever aquatic displays might be attempted before the underworld of chambers and lifts was added. On the platform of the former lake, the new oval gathered the neighborhoods toward it. The colossal statue of Nero, recast as a sun god and standing nearby, gave the amphitheater its popular name in time. But the official title made the point that mattered to Vespasian. It was the amphitheater of the Flavians. It belonged to a dynasty that promised stability after a season of chaos. The finishing touches under Vespasian demonstrate a respect for the spectator's experience that was both calculating and humane. The outer pavements were graded to speed arrivals and departures. Milestones and plaques recorded which entrance served which wedge of seating, so that a citizen knew where to go and could teach his son the route. The builders left square corbels projecting from the attic story to anchor ropes for the awning. The fleet at Misenum, skilled in handling canvas and rigging, would later be called to operate that canopy on long summer afternoons. Everything about the design suggested a wish to keep the crowd comfortable and to keep the spectacle moving. Then there was the matter of time. Vespasian began the work around the year 72. He saw the oval rise tier by tier, but death kept him from presiding over the first games. His son, Titus, inherited both the throne and the project, and would soon open the doors to the people in a festival that sought to bind a new reign to a grateful city. For now, in the closing years of Vespasian's life, the building itself was the message. Where there had been a private lake, there now stood a public arena. Where a single man had once strolled through gilded halls, tens of thousands would soon find their places under a common sky. The morning of the inaugural games dawned with a kind of civic electricity that Romans understood and craved. Word had traveled through the neighborhoods for weeks. Titus would open the new amphitheater with a festival of uncommon length and lavishness. The city was still living in the afterglow of survival. Vesuvius had destroyed towns in the Bay of Naples the year before. A great fire and a pestilence had followed in Rome. The new emperor needed a gesture that would knit the capital together and fix the Flavian name in popular gratitude. An arena that returned the center of the city to the people was the gesture. 100 days of games was the pledge. From the very first hours, The amphitheater declared its purpose as a machine for spectacle and crowd. The entrances were numbered in sequence around the oval, so that a man who held a small ticket chip of bone or pottery could find his assigned vomitorium without confusion. Arched plaques above the portals still bore numerals cut with the neat hand of a stonecutter. Ushers and urban cohorts kept the flow steady. The seating tiers climbed like a stone hillside. Senators in the marble podia near the parapet, equestrians above them, citizens and their guilds arranged by section in the middle rings, foreign visitors and freedmen in the upper reaches. Women were largely confined to the topmost gallery, except for the small class of Vestal virgins who sat in honor near the floor of the arena. The social order of Rome was visible at a glance. No need of an edict. The building made the law. Before the day grew hot, the sailors of the fleet at Misenum went to work on the Valerium. The awning was not a single skin, but a geometry of canvas panels, masts, and ropes that could be trimmed to catch or spill the sea breeze. The sockets for the masts had been cut into the attic, and the projecting corbels gave the rigging its purchase. From below, the canvas read as a mottled sky. Gaps were left open to let light and air through. When the sun climbed toward noon, attendants walked the aisles with sprinkling vessels and cast a fine spray of cool water into the air. Perfume sometimes scented that mist. Saffron was a favorite. The crowd felt cared for. The emperor looked merciful. The sand of the arena floor was new and pale, raked level by workers who would return between bouts with baskets and shovels. The Latin word for sand was harena, and from it the very idea of the arena took its name. Beneath that wooden floor, in the years after the inauguration, a netherworld of passages and cages and lifts would be built to make the shows more sudden and more theatrical. That underworld belonged to Domitian, the younger brother who followed Titus on the throne. For the moment, the substructures were simpler, and there is reason to believe that the earliest shows depended on scenic wagons and trapdoors rather than the full array of elevators that later astonished the crowd. It began with animals. The morning display in a Roman festival was the Venatio. Hunters in tunics with short spears and nets faced lions from Numidia, leopards from the Atlas, bears brought down from alpine forests, ostriches that ran like wind over sand, and even elephants taught to perform before a roar of human voices. The supply lines behind those mornings were imperial in scope. Governors wrote to the capital about shipments of wild beasts as if they were taxes. Ship captains timed their voyages to keep prized animals alive. There were holding pens outside the city known as vivaria, and there were men who knew how to feed and quiet a panicked leopard at dawn. The edge of risk was the charm. When a handler slipped and a beast leaped toward the barrier, the amphitheater felt the thrill that emperors used as political currency. Hunters who killed with skill were cheered by men who in daily life had no voice in anything. Midday was reserved for the grim punctuation that the Romans called damnatio. The condemned were put to death as warnings and as theatre. The Romans took stories from myth and dressed the part. A prisoner became Orpheus with a lyre and was set among trained animals, then killed when the music stopped. Another was cast as a tragic hero who met a fate that the script required. The cruelty of these interludes has been described by ancient observers and stands as the least flattering mirror of a society that prided itself on order and law. Yet even here, Titus understood the politics of generosity. He used the spectacle to demonstrate clemency. He could stay a sentence. He could commute a punishment. He could let the crowd see his hand as both sword and open palm. The afternoons belonged to gladiators. This was the heart of the program as the Romans measured such things. The men who fought were not all of one kind. There were prisoners of war who had learned to use the weapons of the school. There were slaves whose bodies belonged to their masters. There were free men who found in the arena a path to a kind of celebrity and a payday. The schools trained them carefully. A retiarius with trident and net moved differently from a murmillo behind a broad shield with a heavy sword. The matchmakers staged contrasts. Light against heavy. Speed against strength. The referees kept the bout honest and separated fighters before one could kill with a foul blow. The crowd learned the grammar of that combat and formed attachments to the men. Names were chalked on walls. Oil lamps and cups carried the images of favorite fighters. The emperor knew the favorites too. To spare a man who had pleased the city earned more favor than any statue. Literature gives us a line of sight into the inaugural season that is unusually sharp. The poet Martial dedicated a small book to the games of Titus. It is a collection of epigrams that move quickly from scene to scene. A bull kneels before a youth who has trained it. A stage grove turns to living trees when the scenery is whisked away and men disguised as satyrs pour out with wineskins. A boar spits a hunter and is then turned by a second. Some of these images are likely poetic exaggerations. Others read like eyewitness sketches. Together they confirm the single most important fact about the opening festival. Titus intended to overwhelm the senses. No detail was too small. Wooden balls were sometimes tossed into the crowd bearing inscriptions that could be redeemed for prizes. Food distributions softened the roughness in the upper seats. The emperor performed the role of benefactor, while the building did the heavy lifting of management and awe. Ancient writers love to talk about water in the arena. The Romans called the mock sea battle a naumachia and treasured it. Whether the Colosseum itself was ever flooded to present such a show during the inaugural season remains debated among careful readers of the sources. Some accounts place a watery spectacle in the amphitheater before Domitian built the permanent hypogeum. Others suggest that Titus used a separate basin nearby for the full naval display, while the amphitheater hosted land combat and stage effects. The truth may be that both were tried. Rome liked to try everything once. A city that could bring snow to the Forum by shaving mountain ice for an afternoon was a city that would find a way to float small craft, if only for an hour. The sound inside the new amphitheater was its own element. Trumpets announced the entry of processions. The loudest of the voices came from the Meniana, where the common people sat on wooden benches. Vendors sang the virtues of their olives and nuts. The emperor had a box midway along the long axis, with a view that took in the full ellipse of the sand. On the opposite side was a box for important priests and magistrates. At the ends stood the principal gates. Through the northern gate, the living entered in pageant. Through the southern gate, the dead were carried out at day's end. The crowd watched that ritual with a steady gaze. Romans believed that a society earned its place by the way it faced death. The amphitheater was the arena where that belief was made into choreography. From the first week of the inaugural season, the building showed its intelligence in small, practical ways. Rain threatened. The awning handlers shortened the panels and left wider gaps to let the wind blow through. Heat beat down. Saffron-scented sprays floated and evaporated, and the crowd smelled spice instead of sweat. A bull lunged at a gate. The carpenters were there with wedges and new planks. An afternoon ran late. Torches were brought, and the last bout finished in a ring of smoky gold light. The arena could be emptied in minutes. The streets outside were broad enough to take the rush without disorder. The emperor could leave without delay through his private passage that tunneled beneath the stands. Long before the word logistics had the weight we give it now, the Romans practiced logistics with a cold intelligence that would be the envy of any modern impresario. There was, in those first months, a sense that Rome had recovered something older than the reign of Nero. The amphitheater stood where a lake once lay. The neighbor hills looked down on an ellipse that caught the light through its arches in a sequence that changed with the hour. The travertine flashed at noon. The lower arcades glowed at sunset. Pilgrims who had come to the city for festival season wrote home with descriptions that were half architecture and half emotion. The Colossus that had given the new structure its later nickname still stood nearby. A giant bronze once made in the image of Nero and remade as a sun god. A generation later, Hadrian would move it with teams of elephants to a new base close by. For the moment, its shadow at noon fell across the paved courts where the crowd gathered. The pairing was exact. A monstrous emblem of imperial vanity on one side, a popular monument of discipline and entertainment on the other. When Titus closed the long inaugural season, he had done more than open a building. He had rewritten a part of the city's memory. 100 days of slaughter and performance are not the measure by which we would wish to judge a civilization. Yet for Rome, that was part of the ledger. The people went home saying that their emperor had been generous. The Senate could not deny the power of a structure that brought the classes together and made them forget their grievances for an afternoon. Foreign visitors carried the story back to their provinces. Traders who had rented stalls for the season counted their profit. The amphitheater had begun its career as the most visible and audible stage of Rome. In later years, it would change and darken. Subterranean machinery would be added. The scale of the games would wax and wane with the fortunes of emperors. But the inaugural months under Titus set the pattern. A building that organized a city that organized its people, a people that organized their gaze on the man who ruled them. By the time the first generation of Roman spectators had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the new amphitheater, the building had become more than a place. It was a program, a calendar, and an instrument of the state. Under Vespasian and Titus and Domitian, the Flavian years gave the Colosseum its grammar. Morning belonged to the hunt, noon to the spectacle of punishment, afternoon to the measured violence of men who fought under rules. Rome knew that a public given food and marvels would give in return what every ruler desired, a steady consent that made government look effortless. The Colosseum was the best argument that consent could be organized. The morning hunt had an innocence on the surface that dissolved at the first charge of a cat. The Venatio began with processions that paraded the diversity of the empire. Trumpeters at the head, handlers with leads and poles, archers and net throwers, and then boxes and cages from which a low growl or a hiss might carry. The animals came from a supply chain that stretched farther than most Romans would travel in a lifetime. North African lions from the Tripolitan shore, leopards and panthers from the Maghreb, bears coaxed down from Alpine valleys, wolves trapped in the Apennines, aurochs and bison from beyond the Danube, crocodiles and hippopotamus rumored from the Nile marshes when the court wished to astonish. There were ostriches that sprinted like athletes and were pursued by hunters who laughed and puffed while the crowd roared at the absurdity. There were deer fitted with gilded antlers for a moment of pageant before the kill. No morning was the same because the empire itself was never a closed list. When a new province was taken, a new beast might appear, proof in fur or feather that Rome had added another horizon. Behind those mornings was an economy as precise as any merchant's ledger. Provincial governors were judged on their ability to furnish the capital with wonders. Contracts were issued to bestiari and venators, who knew how to trap without ruining the hide, how to calm a lion for the sea voyage, how to feed an animal that would not eat unfamiliar grain. Outside Rome, there were holding parks called vivaria, where animals waited under guard and learned the sounds of the city. The imperial navy brought more than soldiers. Sailors who lofted the velarium in the afternoon had in the morning helped unload the cages at the Tiber's quays. Inscriptions and papyrus receipts speak of fodder, of chains, of handlers paid a bonus if the beast arrived with all its teeth. Nothing about the morning was improvised, except the living response of the crowd. There was choreography in cruelty. The hunts were staged as contests, where men and animals took turns as hunter and hunted. Sometimes the arena floor became a painted African grove, with movable trees hauled on wheeled bases and perfumed branches to suggest a distant landscape. The carpenters who set the scenery knew the schedule and the trapdoors. Domitian, who ruled after Titus, deepened the underworld of the arena with corridors and cells and winches. Dozens of lifting platforms moved men and animals from darkness to daylight in a single drumbeat of astonishment. A handler could bring a leopard to the very edge of the sand without a hint, until the door rose and the animal entered a ring of light to the sound that always followed a sudden appearance, the intake of breath from 50,000 people. At noon, the pageant turned cold. The midday interval was given to sentences carried out in public. The Romans called it damnatio in ludum, or damnatio ad bestias, when the condemned were thrown to animals. The legal name was a reminder that this was not chaos. It was theatre directed by law. Scripts were written from myth and legend. A prisoner played Orpheus and charmed a menagerie with a lyre until the last chord faded and handlers released a bear. Another became a version of Attis or Pentheus, or the thief caught by Diana. The cruelty lies heavy on the page even now. Yet this was a city that believed that public order required public lessons, and the emperor could show a different kind of power when he chose to spare a life. Titus, alert to the opinion of the crowd after the horrors that had visited Italy during his reign, sometimes commuted a punishment and sent a man back into the world. Mercy performed in public was counted twice, once by the victim and once by the audience. The afternoon was the craft of the gladiatorial schools displayed before judges and a public that knew the rules. The great training compound called the Ludus Magnus stood only a short walk from the eastern curve of the amphitheatre. Its small practice arena still spoke the language of the larger one, an oval with galleries for trainers and patrons who came to scout talent. Other schools in the city specialized by style or region. Inside the schools, physicians tended injuries, diet was measured, wood weapons taught balance and distance before iron was allowed. Contracts were real instruments that could bind a free man to a set number of bouts in exchange for prize money, and that could bind a slave to a career with the chance of freedom at the end if his owner felt the accounts balanced. On the sand, the types announced themselves in armor. The Myrmilio carried a heavy rectangular shield and a straight sword, and wore a crested helmet with a face grill. The Thrakes carried a small shield and a curved blade, quick on his feet and fond of feints. The Retiarius wore no helmet and fought with a net and a trident, and his natural opponent was the Secutor, a chaser with a smooth helmet whose eye holes were narrow slits that reminded the crowd that he was ready to run down his man. There were hoplomachii and provocatores and mounted eques. The editors who arranged the program sought balance. An afternoon that offered only slaughter would sour the mood. An afternoon that offered only draws would disappoint. The men who carried the batons and enforced the rules were the Summa Rudis and the Secunda Rudis, chief and assistant referees. They were often retired fighters who knew the difference between a cut that could be bandaged and a wound that ended a life. It is a mistake to think of the crowd as a single appetite. The Senate watched for elegance of form and mastery of technique. Traders from the Subura rooted for spectacle and for names that had become the talk of taverns. Boys learned the gestures. The gesture that decided a life is often stated as a thumb turned down. The phrase in Latin is uncertain, and the sources do not agree. What matters is that the decision belonged to the editor and to the emperor, and that the crowd believed it had earned a voice. A man who had fought bravely might be spared, allowed to raise his finger to the ring and circle the arena, while the attendants walked beside him with palm fronds. A man who had won enough might be granted a wooden sword called a rudis, the symbol of freedom. Those who carried a rudis sometimes returned as trainers or referees, and sometimes returned to the sand as free men who liked the heat of the lights. Between bouts, the arena staff worked like a road crew after a storm. Sand was raked and fresh sand was sprinkled where blood had pooled. Bodies were removed through the southern gate, which became known in time as the Gate of Death. Water-bearers refreshed men who had fought to a draw and would fight again in a later season. Vendors threaded the aisles with trays of dates and nuts and wine watered to a sensible strength. Musicians kept the tone apart from the moments when the crowd wanted silence. It is difficult to imagine the control that was required to keep an audience of 50,000 souls from turning restive. The building helped. The exits were wide, the aisles were numbered, the breeze under the velarium kept tempers cool. The Romans knew how to manage a mass of people, because they had practiced it for centuries at triumphs and funerals and assemblies. The amphitheater brought that knowledge inside stone. Evidence for the scale of the Flavian spectacles is found not only in texts, but in images that were meant to last. Mosaics from provincial villas show armored pairs in the attitudes of the afternoon, with names lettered above their heads. Lamps molded in clay carry figures of fighters and of animals. A relief from the Ludus Magnus shows a referee with his baton raised and a fallen man asking for mercy. Martial's poems match those images with flashes of detail. Suetonius offers imperial anecdotes about Titus and Domitian as editors of games. Coins issued by the Flavian house carry the profile of the amphitheater itself and of the colossal statue nearby, a small promise in metal that the dynasty had given a gift beyond the life of any one man. The engineering of spectacle matured in these years. Domitian had the underfloor machinery perfected. The hypogeum became a maze of parallel corridors and cross tunnels. Cages slid on runners to meet lift shafts. Winches turned and platforms rose smoothly to the arena level so that a door could open on what had not been there a moment before. Stagehands carried signals and kept count. A carpenter who misread his cue could kill a man by lifting the wrong gate at the wrong instant. The emperor took pride in the intricacy. The crowd took pleasure in the surprise. A writer of the next century called it magic with ropes and wheels. He was not wrong. The purpose behind the spectacle remained political. Rome had learned from generations of rulers that public display could bind a city that was otherwise too large for a single will. The Colosseum, set where Nero's lake had insulted the people, embodied the reversal of a policy that had favored private pleasure. Bread was distributed during some festivals. Tokens called tesserae were thrown to the crowd and redeemed for gifts. On certain days, Titus, and later Domitian, invited foreign delegations to sit in honor and witness the order in which the city arranged itself. The amphitheater taught foreigners that Rome's power was a matter of engineering and law as much as of legions. There were limits, and part of the story of the Flavian era lies in those limits. The rumor that a full naval battle was staged inside the amphitheater has never vanished, but the permanent hypogeum installed by Domitian made future flooding impossible. Even earlier, there are reasons to believe that the experiment was rare and modest. The Roman passion for the Naumachia found a better home in basins constructed for the purpose, where water did not threaten to rot beams or to soften the foundation. The amphitheater did not need ships to be astonishing. A pair of leopards loosed from opposite ends of the sand and turning toward one prey could draw a sound from the seats that carried out into the streets. The Flavian era also fixed the citizenship of the building in the daily life of the city. On game days, the Ludus Magnus sent its men through the underground corridor that connected school to arena. The gladiators entered unseen until they were meant to be seen. Priests from nearby shrines walked solemnly through the north gate at intervals to purify the sand with rites that a Roman would have recognized as a negotiation between human law and divine favor. On non-game days, the outer arcades hosted vendors and petitioners. The stones earned rent. The public came to the building to meet friends, to show a cousin from the provinces the size of the entrance arches, to tell stories of the moment when a favorite fighter had looked up and seemed to nod. If there is a single figure who embodies the arc of the Flavian spectacle, it is the conscientious editor who understands that the building is a tool. Titus opened the amphitheater to heal a city. Domitian deepened its machinery to sharpen its bite. The years that followed would test Rome with fires and tremors and moral debates about what could be allowed in public. But during the Flavian years, the amphitheater reached a working maturity. It could present a morning of hunts that rivaled a menagerie, a noon that served the strict letter of law, and an afternoon that balanced risk and art. It could shelter a citizen from the sun and guide him home at dusk. It could bring a senator and a sailor under the same canvas and make both look toward the same rectangle of sand. It could turn a dynasty into a fact. To witness a full day in the Colosseum at its zenith was to move through a choreography of rank, ritual, commerce, fear, and admiration, all compressed within an ellipse of stone. The building itself imposed a lesson before the first trumpet sounded. A citizen arrived with a small ticket token called a tessera, stamped with an entrance number and a seat section. 80 arched portals encircled the exterior. 76 took in the ordinary crowd. 2 axial gates opened directly to the arena, and 2 discreet passages served the emperor and the Vestal virgins. The cavea rose in 3 great bands that Romans called the ima, the media, and the summa. The podium closest to the sand held senators on marble benches numbered with their names. Above them, the equestrian order filled a tier with stone seats. Higher still sat citizens, arranged by tribe or guild, and in the topmost wooden gallery crowded the poor and many women, set there by the seating laws of Augustus, which tried to translate social hierarchy into architecture. The Vestals were the exception, with honored places near the arena wall. The result was a great diagram of Rome in human form. The noise began early. Trumpeters and horn players marched in procession. Vendors passed with baskets of dates, chickpeas, and honey cakes, and with wines mixed to a sensible strength. Boys pointed out the carved numerals above the arches that even now can still be read in places where restoration has left the ancient surface bare. The sailors from the fleet at Misenum took their stations above, ready to trim the velarium if the sun grew hard. The forest of masts at the crown of the building supported a web of canvas panels that could be set to catch the afternoon breeze or furled when clouds gathered. The scent of saffron water sometimes drifted down the aisles when attendants walked and cast a light spray that cooled faces and kept tempers gentle. Beneath the sand was a world that most spectators never saw. The hypogeum stretched like a 2-level grid of corridors and pens, lined with wooden guideways where cages could slide to the foot of lift shafts. Winches and capstans turned by teams of men raised platforms through trapdoors so precisely that a door could open upon a leopard that had not been there a heartbeat before. Doors were lettered for stage crews who worked from cue-boards. Runners carried signals. A single mistake could send a bear into a passage crowded with handlers or lift a gladiator into an empty ring without his opponent. The carpenters and machinists were as essential to the day as any famous fighter, and emperors who loved the arena counted themselves connoisseurs of these tricks with ropes and wheels. The men who fought in the afternoon had sworn a stark oath: to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, to be killed by iron. The words have come down to us from inscriptions and from the pens of moralists who disapproved and yet could not look away. The schools that trained fighters made the oath more than rhetoric. The largest of them, the Ludus Magnus, stood a short walk to the east and was connected to the amphitheater by a subterranean corridor so that contestants could enter unseen and appear as if conjured. Within the school, a small oval yard repeated in miniature the geometry of the big arena. Trainers taught balance and guard with wooden weapons before any man was trusted with steel. Physicians attended the injured. They stitched, set bones, and changed dressings with a regularity that would later make the reputation of medical men like Galen, who learned his craft among gladiators in Pergamon and wrote coolly of tendon wounds and punctures. The diet of the fighters was heavy on barley and beans. Old writers called them barley men, a nickname that carried both respect for stamina and a sneer from gourmands who preferred refined wheat. To a spectator, the afternoon seemed to arrange itself by types. A Murmillo strode out with a large rectangular shield and a straight sword. His helmet carried a bold crest, and the grill over the face gave him a solemn air. A Threx faced him sometimes, lighter on his feet, wielding a curved blade and a small shield that demanded quickness rather than stubborn guard. The Retiarius fought without a helmet. He carried a trident and a weighted net and a dagger at his belt, and he fenced with a style that relied on distance and timing. His natural foil was the Secutor, whose helmet was smooth and rounded, so that a net would slide off, and whose eye slits were narrow to protect against the prongs of the trident. There were provocateurs with paired equipment who met each other to test pure skill, hoplomachy who recalled Greek styles, and mounted equities who dazzled the crowd with short bouts of cavalry grace. The pairings were never left to chance. Editors who arranged the program wanted contrast and drama, and referees who were often retired. Fighters patrolled the sand with batons to keep the rules. They called a halt when a man fell and stood between combatants to judge whether the fight should continue, and their presence gave the afternoon a shape that the crowd trusted. The moment of decision after a fall has lived a long life in art and in misremembering. Ancient sources describe appeals for mercy and the signaling of the crowd, but the famous gesture of a thumb turned down as the sign of death is not a fixed rule in the texts. What is firm is that the editor and the emperor held the final choice, and that the public believed its voice mattered. The crowd shouted Mittite for spare him and Jugula for kill him. A fighter who had given a brave show might be granted his life to fight again. A fighter who had won enough might be awarded a wooden sword called a rudis, the symbol of freedom. Men who received a rudis sometimes stayed in the game as trainers, referees, or even exhibition fighters who demonstrated techniques without the risk of a fatal stroke. The tropes of honor mattered in this place of calculated cruelty, and the subtle economy of reputation made a difference at the instant when a life could hang on the mood of 1,000 throats. Death was a ritual as much as a result. When a man died on the sand, attendants entered with a small cart and a hook. The body was tested to be sure the bout had truly ended a life. Then the dead were taken through the southern portal that came to be called the Gate of Death, named for the goddess of funerals, whose old sanctuary had been a place where undertakers bought their licenses. The living who had triumphed often circled the arena with palm branches as musicians played and the smoke of sacrificial incense drifted from a small altar. Victory was framed as a gift of the gods and of the emperor, which is to say it was framed as a civic lesson. Midday stood between morning hunts and afternoon combats like a cold island. It belonged to the law. Sentences were carried out in the presence of the multitude. Some condemned were sent against wild beasts. Others died by sword. Roman dramatists and impresarios borrowed scenes from myth and refashioned them into grim pageants in which the condemned served as actors. A man became Orpheus and tamed trained animals with a lyre until the illusion shattered. A woman became the maiden of a story that could end only in blood. These spectacles tell us more than we wish about the Roman talent for turning punishment into theatre. They also tell us that clemency performed in public could be turned to political credit. An emperor who spared a prisoner at the plea of a crowd could claim both firmness and mercy, the twin virtues of a ruler who knew the temperature of his city. The place of women in the stands and on the sand reveals something of Rome's contradictions. Most women watched from the upper gallery by law, yet a few extraordinary women entered the arena as fighters. The figure of the gladiatrix flickers through the record in inscriptions and in reliefs from distant provinces. Their bouts were rare, and Emperor Septimius Severus eventually forbade them in the 3rd century. but the very fact that they existed reminds us that the arena could bend rules when novelty promised applause. On the imperial side of the spectacle, another reversal was even more startling. Commodus, in a later age, entered the arena himself with theatrical weapons and a stage-managed program that ensured his triumphs. The scandal of an emperor playing at gladiator shows what the Colosseum had become by then, not only a stage for imperial power, but also a mirror that could reflect imperial vanity to the point of danger. Archaeology adds touches that no historian should ignore. The Ludus Magnus still lies visible at ground level, a rectangle of foundations and a training arena with its own cavea. Drainage channels tell of regular washing. Barracks rooms line the sides, making clear that the life of a fighter was regimented. In the Colosseum itself, the pockmarks on travertine blocks show where iron clamps were pried out in later centuries when the building became a quarry. In the arena, cuttings in the stone ring that held the parapet reveal anchor points for the machinery that raised scenery and cages. In the corridors, one can still trace painted numbers and carved letters that guided a crowd through a day that might see 20 or more set pieces rise and fall. To speak of mortality is to enter a field of numbers that the sources do not fix. Modern estimates for deaths in the arena vary. Some scholars propose that most bouts did not end in death because fighters were valuable investments and drew crowds when they returned. Others argue that death was frequent enough to feed the appetite of a public that expected blood. The truth likely lies between. The best evidence suggests that a significant share of matches ended with a man wounded and spared, that a smaller share ended in a death that the editor and the emperor sanctioned, and that the midday punishments accounted for many of the bodies that passed through the southern gate. What is certain is that medicine learned from these wounds, and that the schools kept careful records of men whose careers rose and ended under the eyes of doctors as well as fans. Religion hovered at the edges of the spectacle. Priests purified the sand with rites. Small altars smoked at the entry of processions. On certain days, the games were dedicated to a god whose favor was sought. The language of sacrifice was never far away. The Roman mind could understand a gladiator as a victim offered to the public good, and a victor as a man touched by providence. That language made the cruelty legible to citizens who would otherwise have struggled to explain to themselves why they watched. There is an intimacy to the way the crowd and the fighters spoke to one another that no distant moral judgment can erase. A boy who watched from the middle tier learned the posture of a man who asked for mercy or refused it. He learned the sound of 1,000 voices, turning in a single breath from joy to grief. He learned the names of men he would never meet and traced them with a stylus on a lamp or a wall. At the gate, he passed a chessboard scratched into the paving where 2 soldiers played between bouts. At a stall, he bought an oil lamp with a figure of a retiarius that would burn in his house that night. What he carried home was a set of memories and a set of lessons that the state wished him to remember. Order can be managed. Courage is a public currency. Mercy can be the work of a single raised hand. In that exchange of signals between sand and stone lay the secret of the arena's hold on Rome. It was a place where the city rehearsed its virtues and its vices, where men of little account could shout a word that mattered, and where the emperor could shape opinion by choosing when to be generous and when to be severe. Life and death in the Colosseum were more than outcomes of individual bouts. They were a pattern of instruction written in dust and blood that told Romans who they were. The Colosseum was built to command weather and time, but it could not abolish either. The first 2 centuries of its life had trained Rome to think of the amphitheater as indestructible. The arches looked as natural as cliffs, the travertine as permanent as a hillside. Then the 3rd century arrived with a series of shocks that made the city confront the limits of even Roman engineering. What followed was a long education in repair, an art that the ancients practiced with a seriousness equal to their passion for building. The first great wound came in the year 217. Cassius Dio tells a simple story with a terrible image. Lightning struck and fire took hold in the upper works. The fourth tier of the amphitheater had a great deal of timber in its galleries and roof frames, and once flame found the dry wood, the blaze traveled fast along beams and rafters. The canvas equipment for the awning was stored nearby and added fuel. The iron clamps that bound stone to stone did not burn, but when they were heated and cooled in quick succession, they lost temper and gripped less surely. The masonry did not melt, yet it could crack when beams collapsed and drove shock through the arcades. Fire in a building this large becomes a kind of weather of its own. It makes wind. It draws air where there is none. The sound would have been like a storm in stone. The fire forced a long closure. Sources suggest that the arena was unusable for years, while repairs were planned and then carried out. The early 3rd century was not a time of calm governance. Emperors rose and fell with a violence that left little room for long projects. Yet the amphitheater mattered too much to be left as a blackened shell. The first effort was to secure the outer ring. Where the fire had weakened lintels and arches, masons inserted brick relieving arches and concrete plugs. The upper wooden structures were rebuilt with a more cautious mix of timber and masonry. Seats that had been planked in wood at the highest level were reconstructed with more permanent materials in places, and access stairs were rebuilt with careful attention to the way a panicked crowd might try to flee in a future disaster. The masts for the awning were reset, and their sockets were dressed with new lead, so that rain would not gather and rot the timbers below. The hypogeum beneath the arena floor had been deepened and rationalized under Domitian a century earlier. Fire there could smolder in hidden corners long after the visible blaze had been beaten. The repair crews learned to search with rods and to listen for the hollow sound that meant a cavity was packed with ash beneath a crust of charcoal. Cages were rebuilt. The runners on which they slid were planed smooth and rubbed with fat to renew the silent movement that made surprise possible. Winches were remade with new axles. The carpenters who measured these parts had a vocabulary that any shipwright would have understood. A lift platform that rose in a steady line required trueness in every timber. Rome had no patience for a show that snagged or clattered in a way that broke the spell of the afternoon. Inscriptions and brick stamps give glimpses of the trade that followed the fire. There are bricks bearing marks of workshops active in the decades after 217. Their presence in the upper galleries tells us that the rebuilding was both thorough and methodical. Names of curators appear in fragments, the officials who oversaw the fabric of the amphitheater as part of the urban administration. To hold such an office was to be responsible for public safety as well as for public delight. A cracked pier that supported a flight of stairs could kill more Romans in a panic than any animal in the sand. The curators knew this. They ordered surveys of joints. They had men tap stone with hammers and listen for the dull sound that betrays a void behind a face of travertine. During these works, the arena did not vanish from civic life. Lesser entertainments found their way into the open precincts around the structure. The outer arcades continued to host vendors and craftsmen. The amphitheater was still the center of a small economy even when the seats were closed. It is likely that portions of the building reopened in stages. A tier might be declared safe while bricklayers labored overhead. The complaint that Rome was always under scaffolding has ancient roots. The greatest city in the Mediterranean was in a state of continual repair because continual use demanded it. Earth itself gave the next lesson. In the 5th century, a series of earthquakes shook Italy. A strong tremor in the year 443 is recorded as having damaged the amphitheater. What does damage mean in such a structure? It means cracks that run through the haunch of an arch and put the curve out of true. It means joints opening a finger width where there should be none. It means the slow assembly of settlements in foundations where the underlying soil yields in one place and holds in another. The Colosseum straddled ground that had once been an artificial lake. The northern half sat on firmer soil. The southern half lay over fill, compacted to take a monumental load. Roman engineers knew how to build on such a site. They dug to stable strata and poured concrete rings. Even so, a strong tremor does not read a blueprint. It sends waves through alluvium, and the waves do not match the rhythms of stone. Repair in an age of shrinking resources required triage. The city faced new pressures. The Western Empire was weakening. Trade had become less predictable. The old rhythms of supply that brought marble from distant quarries and timber from far forests faltered. In such years, the stewards of the amphitheater chose their battles. The most crucial supports were strapped with iron and bound with fresh mortar. Areas that could be closed without provoking public anger were left quiet. The uppermost galleries were sometimes the first to be abandoned. The logic was brutal and honest. Better to bring the crowd lower where the structure was strongest than to pretend that every seat could be used forever. There were fires of a different sort as well. Small blazes set by vendors and squatters in the arcades during quiet years left smoky marks that archaeologists read centuries later like fingerprints. Lamps tipped. Braziers sparked. Soot crept into mortar and stained a vault. The record of these lesser accidents is not grand. Yet, it reminds us that the Colosseum was a living part of the city. A neighborhood grew around it that never asked leave of an emperor. Smiths set up in alcoves. Tanners laid out skins to dry. There were gardens planted in the filled arena during the later centuries when performance waned. Soil thrown over the old floor held moisture and invited seed. Weeds rooted in joints on the sunlit side of the outer wall and sent thin roots into mortar. When rain followed a dry spell, the roots swelled and pried at joints as effectively as any wedge. Nature extracts a toll even when politics falls quiet. The curators fought back with lime and with law. Mortar was repointed on the weather face of the southern arcades. Drips were chiseled into stone to carry rainwater clear of vulnerable joints. Drainage channels were cleared so that standing water would not invite rot in timber or frost heave in winter. Decrees were issued that forbade the dumping of refuse near the foundations. Fines were threatened for anyone who broke into sealed parts of the structure. The city could never police every arch, but the fact of such orders tells us that there were still officials who believed the amphitheater deserved guardians. The memory of Christian Rome enters the story during these centuries in a way that belongs to resilience as much as to decline. A small oratory was established within the arena in the 6th century. Stations of the cross would later be installed around the interior by a pope who wished the place to serve as a memorial to the martyrs. The historical question of whether Christians died here in great numbers is a field of debate among scholars. What matters for the fate of the building is that Rome came to see the amphitheater through a new lens. It was no longer only a theater of secular entertainment. It had become a moral landscape as well. That shift helped to preserve stone that might otherwise have vanished more quickly. One can still read in the masonry where ancient repairs differ from original work. The Flavian stone is clean and the joints are tight and proud. 3rd century repairs often use brick in arches and as needles driven through the depth of a pier to tie a fissure. 5th century mortars are rougher and settled in less carefully. Where earthquakes bit deep, facades were patched with rough stones taken from elsewhere and fit to mask a wound rather than to heal it. The outer ring shows anchor scars where iron clamps were set. Later centuries would gouge these out for metal, but even before that vandalism, the marks record the places that had been opened and closed by honest repair. When the amphitheater reopened fully after the early 3rd century fire, the city returned with the loyalty of habit. The morning hunts resumed with their old mixture of wonder and risk. The noon punishments continued to bind law to theatre. The afternoon bouts found their balance again between skill and spectacle. In the years after the Great Tremor of 443, the building still welcomed crowds. There were fewer of the immense festivals that had marked the Flavian Age. Money was tighter. Animals were harder to find and to ship. The underfloor machinery creaked more often. Even so, the habit of Rome endured. Families came because they had always come. Senators came because to be seen there was to be seen at the center of civic life. The emperor came because the amphitheater remained the one place where he could look upon the city and feel its gaze upon him in return. Resilience is not a romance. It is the unglamorous labor of inspection and patching, and the frank admission that some parts cannot be saved without risking the whole. The Colosseum lived through the 3rd and 5th centuries, because the Romans who cared for it understood their craft, and because the building itself allowed for repair. Arches fail gracefully when they are given a chance. A damaged course can be unseated and reset without bringing down the entire curve. A pier can be relieved with a brick arch set behind its face. The amphitheater taught its own keepers how to mend it. What makes this period of disaster and repair so instructive is that it reminds us that great monuments are not single moments in stone. They are careers. Fire did not end the Colosseum. Earthquake did not end it. Shortages did not end it. Each blow revealed the intelligence within its bones and the persistence of a city that refused to let its center go dark. There would come a time when games would cease for reasons that were political and spiritual rather than structural. But before that turning of the age, the amphitheater proved that survival could be a civic virtue. The end of the games did not arrive with a single trumpet call. It came by degrees, through new faith and new law, through the thinning of imperial revenues, and through the tired conscience of a city that had watched too much blood. By the early 4th century, the empire had been remade by a ruler who saw advantage in the cross. Constantine legalized Christianity and drew bishops into the orbit of power. He did not close the amphitheaters, but he altered the moral weather. Christian writers began to speak more loudly against spectacles that trained the eye to delight in suffering. Tertullian had already called the games poison to the soul. Later, Augustine of Hippo told of a friend who wandered into an amphitheater and came out changed for the worse, his senses captured by the roar of the crowd and the sight of wounds. The old civic language that justified the games as instruction in courage began to sound defensive. Law followed belief in small steps. Constantine issued orders that certain criminals be sent to the mines rather than to the beasts, and that judges spare slaves from punishments that belonged to a pagan past. The Theodosian Code later set boundaries around the calendar, keeping the amphitheaters shut on Sundays and on feast days of the church. These edicts did not empty the seats. They did something subtler. They made the spectacles feel out of step with the rising rhythm of Christian time. A Roman could attend a hunt on a weekday, yet he would now be reminded by priests and magistrates that there were days when the arena must sleep. Economics conspired with conscience. The supply lines that had once brought lions from Numidia and leopards from Mauritania began to fray. The 3rd and 4th centuries had seen invasions across the Danube and the Rhine. The 5th century brought the Vandals to North Africa, a loss that pinched both grain and animals. A hunt required money and ships, keepers and fodder, and a crowd willing to pay attention. The treasuries of emperors who held only Italy and a slice of Gaul could not match the largesse of a Trajan who had ruled from Britain to the Persian frontier. Editors who hoped to buy popularity with lavish shows found that the market was not what it had been. The taste for novelty remained, but the purse was thin. It is tempting to search for a single scene that ends the story of gladiators. The tale that comes closest is told by Theodoret of Cyrus in a history written decades after the fact. He says that a monk from the east named Telemachus traveled to Rome and found the crowd gathered for combat. He climbed down into the arena and tried to separate the fighters. The people stoned him. Word of the killing reached the Emperor Honorius, who was so horrified that he abolished the contests. The date given by tradition is the year 404. Scholars have wrestled with the details and with the reliability of the source. Yet the story has endured because it captures a truth. By the first years of the 5th century, the sight of a Christian holy man dying in the dust of the amphitheater no longer looked like a proper civic ritual. It looked like a scandal. Honorius did issue laws against gladiatorial combat. If the prohibition was not perfectly observed, it was observed enough to change the character of the place. The end of gladiator schools can be traced in silence. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, the names of famous fighters flicker in graffiti and in inscriptions. By the 5th century, those voices grow faint. The Ludus Magnus still stood beside the Colosseum, its practice yard repeating the oval geometry of the big arena, its barracks and training halls waiting for footsteps. The flow of recruits dwindled. Contracts that had bound free men to a set number of bouts in exchange for prize money were not renewed. The physicians who had learned tendon and bone by tending fighters were called elsewhere. The oath of the fighter, with its stark promise to be burned and bound and beaten and killed by iron, belonged to an older page of Roman life. Hunts outlasted duels. The love of spectacle did not vanish with the fighters. Venaciones continued into the 5th century and into the 6th. A Roman aristocrat could still win applause by paying for a day of staged wilderness. The last such day that the sources name with any certainty came in the year 523, when the consul Anicius Maximus spent a fortune on a holiday of animal shows. The Ostrogothic king Theodoric, who ruled Italy in the name of Roman continuity, rebuked him for waste. The letter that carries the rebuke was written by Cassiodorus, a statesman with a careful pen. It shows an age that still knew the language of Roman office, but had begun to write its budgets in smaller numbers. The imperial presence inside the Colosseum had altered long before the final bans. Commodus in the late 2nd century had entered the arena himself to play at combat behind a shield of precautions. He killed animals from a platform and fought staged matches that could not go wrong. The people were scandalized and fascinated in equal measure. Later, emperors were more careful. They sat in the honor box and let others run the risks. By the time of Honorius, the imperial gaze had grown cool. The court had moved to Ravenna, a city of marshes and brick churches. The emperor looked out on water and reeds, not on the ellipse of sand. Rome was still Rome, but decisions that defined its seasons were now made far away. Christian Rome put new meanings into the old stones. A small chapel was established within the Colosseum by the 6th century. There are records of clergy who served there, and there are traces of devotional use that archaeologists read in the walls. Later ages would add the Stations of the Cross and declare the site a memorial to martyrs. The historical question of how many Christians died in the amphitheater is vexed and will likely remain so. What can be said with confidence is that by turning the building into a sacred space, even in a modest way, the church gave the ruin a second life. A place that had instructed Romans in power and death now taught a lesson about suffering and redemption. That change in meaning slowed the appetite for spolia, for the habit of tearing down old buildings for new stone. Yet spolia came all the same. In the later 5th and early 6th centuries, the city needed roofs and walls more than it needed bleachers. Marble facings that had once gleamed in the Colosseum were pried off and burned in lime kilns. Iron clamps that bound block to block were gouged out of their beds and carried to forges. Travertine blocks fell in earthquakes and were carted to building sites. The amphitheater had stopped giving public pleasure and had begun to give fabric to a city that had shrunk within its ancient walls. The missing part of the Colosseum was already beginning to be written into the churches and palaces of Christian Rome. The moral map of the city changed. Bishops preached against the old amusements, and offered a new calendar filled with processions and fasts and feasts. Wealthy houses competed to fund basilicas and baptisteries rather than hunts. The rhetoric of generosity moved from the amphitheater to the altar. Charity bought salvation in place of applause. The crowd found other places to gather. Chariot racing in the circus survived longer than combat in the Colosseum. But even the races lost their edge in a Rome that was learning the quieter rituals of a Christian capital. A final detail says much about this turning. When an earthquake in the 5th century cracked parts of the amphitheater, repairs were made where they could be afforded. Elsewhere, galleries were closed. The uppermost wooden seating that had once carried the tumult of the common people fell out of use. Fences were nailed across stairways. The crowd looked elsewhere for its afternoons. The silence of a corridor that had once thrummed with footsteps is a historical fact as solid as any brick. The last gladiators had gone. The last hunters would not be far behind. The Colosseum that emerged from this change was still enormous and still central to the urban landscape, but it had shed the daily purpose that had made it an engine of consent. The power of the building became memory. A citizen walking its perimeter now recalled scenes that his grandfather had witnessed and that his grandchildren would only hear. The amphitheater had entered a new career as a monument in search of meaning. That search will give it its medieval life and will prepare the way for the question that animates our story: what happened to the missing part? When the last gladiators were gone and the hunts grew rare, the Colosseum did not fall silent so much as it changed its voice. In late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, the arena ceased to be a theater of state and became a piece of the city's everyday life. The ellipse of travertine that had once held Rome in thrall now held bakers and smiths, cobblers and beggars, widows and soldiers between campaigns. The building that had staged imperial power learned to weather smaller sovereignties, the powers of clan, guild, and parish. The arena floor filled first. The wooden decking and the sand had been stripped and scavenged. Wind carried soil into the pit, and people carried more. By slow accretion, the hollow that had once opened onto the hypogeum became a level patchwork of earth and rubble. Graves appeared. Modest headstones were set along the edge of the central space, while the sun warmed the ring, where senators had once Saturday gardens were planted in that same soil. Travelers speak of cabbages and beans growing within the walls. A place that had fed a taste for blood now fed families with leaves and pods. Goats and sheep nibbled the grass that sprang from cracks in the lower arcades. A ruin is a patient teacher. It shows a city how to reuse what it can no longer afford to keep perfect. Around the rim of the arena, the vaulted passages filled with life. Shop tables were set beneath arches. Tanners stretched skins. Smiths beat iron on small anvils that rang against ancient stone. The smell of charcoal mingled with the damp of the vaults in winter. The labyrinth that had once moved crowds with the speed of a river became a bazaar of small trades and a neighborhood of improvised rooms. In certain bays, the plaster was painted with quick saints, a sign that a corner had been claimed by a confraternity or a devout craftsman. The amphitheater that had taught Romans where they belonged now learned to house people who belonged wherever they could. Medieval Rome did not remember the amphitheater with perfect clarity. Learned men kept the word amphitheatrum, and pilgrims who read the guidebook called the Mirabilia Urbis could find the old name on its pages. Yet legends multiplied. Some believed the building had been a palace of ancient kings. Others were sure it had been a temple to the Sunday. Some whispered of sorcery performed by philosophers who commanded spirits to set the stones. An English proverb attributed to a venerable monk stated in solemn Latin that while the Colosseum stood, Rome would stand, that when the Colosseum fell, Rome would fall, and that when Rome fell, the world would fall. The ruin had become a mirror in which the Middle Ages saw both pride and warning. By the 11th and 12th centuries, great families discovered in the old amphitheater a fortress ready-made. The Frangipani, a clan whose power ran through the southern quarter of the city, seized the Colosseum and laced its arches with walls, gates, and fighting platforms. They understood what the Flavians had known. Whoever held the ellipse held a crossroads. From its crown one could watch the Palatine and the Caelian, the Forum and the approach from the Lateran. Towers rose where spectators had once climbed to wooden benches. Arrow slits replaced graceful arcades along key fronts. Chains could be drawn across the ring passages to seal sections in an instant. When the city quarreled, the Colosseum became a citadel. The histories of the period leave glimpses of siege and parley at the amphitheater. A German emperor on progress through Italy took hospitality under its vaults and called on the Frangipani to make peace with rivals for the sake of imperial ceremony. Roman nobles mustered men-at-arms in the shadow of the southern arcades before hurrying to the bridge of the Tiber. On quiet mornings, the interior court served as a parade ground where mailed riders tested saddles and grooms watered horses at barrels lifted over ancient thresholds. The Oval had become a courtyard, and the city learned to walk through it without seeing spectacle, only strength. The Frangipani did not hold their prize uncontested. The Annibaldi, a rising family with castles along the Appian Way, pressed claims near the amphitheater and fought for influence over the adjoining streets. Masonry that had been meant to frame games now framed disputes between cousins of Rome. When the Frangipani power waned in the 13th century, the arena passed through hands with the same implacable logic as any tower or bridge. A medieval monument is a ledger of possession no less than a poem of memory. Religion continued to make a modest home inside the stones. Small oratories were set within certain bays. A chapel took form along a corridor and gathered its own community, with a lamp that burned at evening and a wooden altar built from scavenged beams. Processions of Holy Week sometimes threaded near the amphitheater, and the curve of the exterior wall offered a sounding board for chants that rose from the Lateran toward the Forum. The idea that the place held the memory of martyrs took firmer root as the centuries advanced. Whether that memory matched the arithmetic of ancient executions mattered less to a devout mind than the feeling that the ground was heavy with testimony and pain. Nature worked at the edges of everything. Seeds dropped by birds found a purchase in mortar joints. After a rain, the roots swelled and pried at seams. Ivy learned the ledges of the exterior and draped an arcade in green. In spring, the upper tiers showed a thin crown of flowers. Scholars of a later century would count dozens upon dozens of species and marvel at how many corners of the known world had sent their plants on the wind to this one ellipse. In the Middle Ages, no one kept such lists, yet everyone saw that the ruin had put on a kind of garment, a faded robe woven by rain, and Sunday. Daily use left marks that archaeologists would later read like a diary. Soot blackened the crown of vaults where braziers had burned through winter nights. Thresholds wore smooth where carts had passed from stall to stall. In the exterior arches, masons set rough blocking walls of salvaged stone to hold shutters and doors. The careful courses of Flavian travertine were interrupted by medieval patchwork, honest work by men who had more energy than money. In one bay, an apse was framed and whitewashed so that a priest could preach on market days. In another, a wine seller hung a sign and chalked prices on his wall. From time to time, Rome drew dangerous attention. In the year when a Norman army came to rescue a pope and burned large quarters of the city, people fled into whatever strong buildings they could find. The amphitheater was such a refuge and such a target. The fire that followed ran along streets and courtyards. In the smoke, the Colosseum showed again why emperors had loved it. Its ring of stone did not easily ignite. It took blows better than any palace. It sheltered families and soldiers behind its thick piers. Authority shifted as popes found their footing in the later Middle Ages and began to think of the ancient city as a treasury to be curated rather than a field to be fought over. A few edicts tried to regulate who could build within the amphitheater and who could claim its bays, and fines were set for those who damaged the structure. The will to enforce such rules varied with the strength of the pontiff and with the price of stone in a city that was always building. Yet the idea that the Colosseum was something more than a quarry took deeper root. A new respect was being learned in fits and starts. Even so, the amphitheater in this period remained above all a lived place. Children learned to kick a ball against its curved wall and hear the reply like thunder. Pilgrims from the north stopped and crossed themselves at the sight of the huge arcades before hurrying on to shrines that dispensed relics and indulgences. Traders moved in the shade that the ancient arches cast across the pavements of morning. At dusk, a candle could be seen in an upper niche where a family had made a room, and beneath them a man closed the shutters of his stall and covered his stock with canvas against dew. Thus the Colosseum entered its medieval career. It became a fortress for the mighty, and a market for the poor, a sanctuary for small devotions and a stage for private quarrels. The missing part that modern eyes notice had not yet come. That would arrive with a quake and with a practice that the city never quite gave up. The practice of taking old stone to build new Rome. But before the fall and the cart, there was this long interval of adaptation, when the greatest amphitheater in the world learned to live as a very large house. To understand what vanished from the Colosseum, one must follow the stones when they left the ellipse. The practice had an old Roman name, spolia. It was not theft in the minds of those who did it so much as thrift, an inheritance taken up by a city that never stopped building. Temples had become churches in late antiquity by this logic. In the Middle Ages, the amphitheater was treated the same way. Its marble could be burned to make lime. Its travertine could be reset in a palace wall. Its iron was worth prying free, even if it scarred the skin of the monument. Marble went first because it was soft to the chisel and obedient to the fire. The facing that once lined passages and stairs had a second life in kilns set in the shadow of the arcades. Lime burners stacked blocks with brushwood and charcoal, fed their domed ovens day and night, and drew out the white powder that made mortar and plaster for a city of builders. The cost ledger favored this work. Quarries were distant. Transport was dear. The quarry you could walk to was a gift. The Colosseum became a standing mine, a mountain that could be harvested in every season. Iron went next, and its removal left the most visible wounds. The Flavian builders had bound the great courses together with iron clamps set in sockets and sealed with lead. In lean centuries, men came with chisels and picks to rob the metal. They cut around the sockets and levered out the clamps. They heated the lead to loosen the grip and poured it away for reuse. Each act left a pockmark on the face of travertine. Walk the outer ring today, and those little gouged pockets read like a tally of centuries of hunger for iron. The stone still bears the memory of 1,000 small decisions to value utility over form. Blocks followed, first the fallen, then the standing. When a pier cracked or an arch slipped, gravity offered stone without argument. Builders arrived with carts and oxen and carried it off to set again elsewhere. As demand grew, licenses were issued that made dismantling an official trade. The commune at times auctioned rights to remove material from certain bays. Later, the papal court became the broker. Documents of the 15th century record permissions that named the Colosseum as a quarry for projects that would reinvent the city. This was the age when Rome decided to dress itself in new marble and to crown its hilltops with churches and palaces worthy of a revived capital. The old amphitheater was pressed into that ambition as a supplier. The traffic of stone fed particular dreams. Families who had once used the Colosseum as a fortress now used it as a bank. Great palaces took shape whose facades carry the quiet strength of reused blocks. A traveler who admired a cornice on a noble residence or the steps before a church might be admiring stone that had once echoed with the footfalls of a crowd hurrying to its seat. Tradition held that travertine from the amphitheater helped to raise parts of St. Peter. The same tradition linked the Colosseum to the palaces of families whose crests ruled the city in the 17th century. Whether every claim is exact is less important than the habit it records. The road from the arena to the building site was well worn. The state took a hand not only by permission, but by plan. Popes who imagined a new Rome after the return from Avignon looked at the amphitheater and saw an account to be settled. Nicholas V authorized the removal of vast quantities of stone for works that would proclaim a reborn city. Cartloads left the southern arcades and rolled across the bridge toward building yards, where masons scored and fitted the travertine into a new geometry. The numbers in the records are sobering. They show the Colosseum serving as a quarry on an industrial scale. In the registers of the papal chamber, the amphitheater appears not as a monument, but as a line of supply. At times, the plan was not to dismantle, but to transform. Sixtus V, who loved bold schemes and straight roads, proposed to make the Colosseum into a wool manufactory. The idea was to give work to the city's poorest women, and to draw a thorn from the side of a pope who wanted order. The oval arena would be floored again. The bays would become workrooms. The arcades would ring with the sound of looms. The project died with the pope, but the proposal itself shows how Romans thought about the great ruin. It was a resource to be spent, or a tool to be adapted, not a relic to be kept behind glass. Economy and devotion sometimes pulled in opposite directions and sometimes came to terms. Chapels and oratories within the amphitheater gave it a modest sanctity that could slow eager hands. Penitential processions circled the outer ring and sang litanies that treated the site as a memory of martyrdom. Yet the same season might see masons building a kiln in a neighboring bay. The guardians of the ruin were not always the most powerful men in the city. Often they were local clergy who cherished a small altar, or neighbors who felt the old arches as a shade in summer and a windbreak in winter, and wished them to remain. The dismantling had its own unwritten rules. Brick was left when stone was scarce. Rubble was packed into voids to keep a pier from failing so that the next cart could still pass. The uppermost galleries were pillaged first because they were least watched and most unstable. The southern flank, built over the softer ground of the old lake, suffered more than the north. It offered easier harvest after storms and tremors. Workshops that rented bays improved their niches with patchwork walls of salvaged stone, but always with an eye to what could be removed quickly if a new license freed a better block nearby. There is a seasonal feel to the record. Winter rains loosened joints. Spring weeds pried at mortar and made stones easy to nudge. Summer brought demand for mortar and plaster as projects hurried to finish before a patron returned from the countryside. Autumn carts creaked with harvest and with stone. The city's calendar and the ruins calendar moved together. Men who served one often served the other. A laborer who carried baskets of lime in a kiln by night might guide a noble visitor through the arcades by day and point out where an ancient inscription still clung to a pier. Human stories cling to these stones as surely as ivy. A mason teaching his son to read numbers carved above an entrance. A widow paying rent for a stall beneath an arch and pleading with an official to be left in peace when a demolition crew arrived. A clerk in the papal chancery balancing accounts for licenses that taxed each cart as it left the precinct. A pilgrim from the north writing home that he had seen the greatest ruin in the world and that Romans were taking it down one block at a time. The dismantling of the amphitheater was not a single act of violence. It was a habit, a civic reflex practiced by many hands over many years. By the 14th century, the practice had already taken a toll that could not be disguised. The outer ring on the south showed stretches where the smooth rhythm of arches was broken by gaps and rough patches. The great ribs that ran between tiers sagged where iron had been robbed. The soil beneath the southern side, always less sure than the volcanic base of the north, quietly settled. When a great earthquake came in that century, the stage had been prepared. What fell would feed building yards for a generation, and the Colosseum would take on the broken profile that has become its icon. From within, the transformation was even more dramatic. The workshops that had once looked makeshift became permanent. The arcades that had been lanes for crowds became storerooms with doors and shutters. The arena that had once swallowed men and animals became a yard where carts turned and animals were watered. The spectacle now was of labor itself, hammers on stone, saws on timber, wheels on cobble. The amphitheater had learned a new role as a factory without machines, a steady engine that converted history into raw material for the next age. And still, in the midst of this long dismantling, awe survived. Travelers sketched the curve of the remaining wall and tried to count the tiers before dusk. Preachers climbed a fragment of stair to address a Lenten crowd and used the ruin as a text about the vanity of earthly power. Local boys raced around the circumference and argued about whether the oval could ever have been whole. Rome lived with its amphitheater as one lives with an ancestor both admired and inconveniencing, a presence that could not be forgotten and could not be kept unchanged. The question of the missing part, therefore, has two answers at this stage of the story. Some of it was shaken down by earth that remembered the lake beneath. Much of it was carried away by carts with legal seals and by men with hot chisels who took iron where they found it. The Colosseum was not only broken by accident, it was unbuilt by policy and by need. In that unbuilding, the city told the truth about itself. Rome is a place where the past is a quarry as well as a scripture. The ruin we recognize today took its signature wound in a single season of fear. In the year 1349, a powerful earthquake shook central Italy. The shock was felt from the Apennines to the sea, and when it reached Rome, it found a city that had already been living on thinner means and living more by salvage than by ceremony. Towers cracked. Churches shed cornices. The great amphitheater beside the old valley of Nero's lake took the blow in a way that would forever change its outline. By evening, the southern half of the outer ring no longer matched the northern. It had come down in a tumble of arches and piers that left the interior galleries open to the weather like the ribs of a whale. Engineers who study old structures can explain in cool terms what panic taught the Romans in a moment. The Colosseum sits on ground that is not the same all the way around. Its northern arc rests closer to ancient tufa and compact gravels that hold well. Its southern arc presses into fill and former lake bed, the place where Vespasian's builders had drained Nero's water and laid a deep annular foundation of concrete and stone. That foundation was a good answer for a wet site, but it remained a ring set partly on firmer ground and partly on softer. Across the centuries, fire and small tremors had opened hairline cracks. The removal of iron clamps in many courses had weakened the lock between blocks. Then the 1349 shock sent waves through the softer southern ground that were out of rhythm with the heavy masonry above. Arches that had learned to transfer weight in a steady cadence had to ride a pulse they could not follow. When one bay failed, it pulled its neighbor. A progressive collapse ran along the curve, and a whole sector gave way. Contemporaries did not write with a structural vocabulary. They wrote with dread. Chroniclers in Rome and in nearby towns took the quake as a sign after years of plague and unrest. They recorded that many buildings fell and that people camped in fields in fear of aftershocks. The fall of the southern side of the amphitheater became a set piece in these accounts. There were stories of dust that rose like a cloud and hung over the Caelian. There were stories of statues that cracked and of doors that jammed in their frames. What the city had thought could not change had changed in an hour, and a familiar oval had become a broken crown. The debris field was vast and useful. Each fallen pier was a quarry already cut to measure. The travertine blocks that had once marched in a perfect sequence of arches lay in squared piles waiting for carts. Scavengers came first to pry free iron and bronze. Then masons came with orders in hand. Licenses from the commune, and later from the papal chamber, permitted the removal of stone. Teams of oxen dragged blocks to building yards. The stone moved into palaces and churches. Some of it went to repair other damage from the quake. In this way, the earthquake did not only destroy, it supplied the means for Rome to heal many smaller wounds. Inside the ellipse, the collapse had the effect of opening a cross-section for all to study. The three rings of superimposed orders that had looked like a single wall were revealed as a brilliant assembly of concentric corridors and radial walls. Citizens could now stand on the open side and see the skeletal logic that had been hidden behind marble and stucco. They saw the annular vaults that carried crowds around the circumference. They saw the stair towers that rose like tree trunks to the upper Mainiana. They saw the inner retaining wall that had held back the seating and the parapet that defended the arena. A building conceived as a machine for movement was now a diagram in stone, half of it gone, half of it laid bare. The quake of 1349 did not act on a perfect object. It acted on a monument already stressed by 2 centuries of neglect and by earlier shocks. A strong tremor in the 5th century had opened fractures and required patching. The long practice of spolia had robbed the outer skin of some of its iron stitching. Mortar in the upper galleries had been churned by weeds and by frost. Small fires in vaulted bays had baked brick and weakened the cohesion of old repairs. When the earth moved, all these factors aligned to make the southern ring the vulnerable quarter. The northern arc, seated more firmly and less plundered in certain runs, kept its rhythm and survived. Reports after the quake speak of emergency measures that have the ring of common sense. Authorities closed sections of the remaining stands. They posted guards at the fallen side to keep scavengers from undermining still-standing piers. They granted selective licenses for carting away loose stone but tried to forbid the cutting of new joints in the surviving walls. Such orders were difficult to enforce in a city with too many needs and too few hands to police them. The southern precinct became a landscape of work. Kilns sprouted to burn marble for lime. A temporary road of timbers was laid to ease the passage of wagons across soft soil where the arena had filled with centuries of earth. There were rumors as well, as there always are when a city suffers. Some said that an omen had been seen in the skies over the Lateran the night before. Others said that Nero's old statue had shivered and that this had called the shock upon its neighbor. Devout voices said that the fall of the amphitheater showed the judgment of heaven upon a place of past cruelty. Practical men shrugged and said that when you remove iron from old work, you must expect the old work to answer you at a bad hour. Both kinds of speech record a fact. The amphitheater's new shape demanded a meaning, and Romans supplied it in many keys. The new profile changed daily life. The southern side now admitted wind and rain into the undercourses, and that weather accelerated decay where vaults were exposed. Plants took hold even more quickly along the fresh fractures. In winter, water froze in the pores of the travertine and pried at the stone along opened beds. In summer, the sun bit hard into surfaces that had once been shaded, and thermal expansion and contraction troubled old joints. The custodians of the ruin, such as they were, could only triage. They bricked up certain arches to keep out squatters. They patched a vault here and a pier there. They had neither the treasury nor the philosophy of conservation that would later call for grand buttresses and deliberate preservation. The amphitheater survived because it was still too useful to lose, and because even wounded it was overbuilt by any ordinary standard. The shock of 1349 did not end the work of the earth. Later tremors in the early modern centuries shook the city again and encouraged further falls. The long quake of 1703 in the center of the peninsula rattled Rome and gave fresh motive to shore what remained. Brick buttresses would one day be set against the flanks to hold the curve in place. That would be the work of a later age whose popes saw value in the eloquence of ruins. In the 14th century, the response was simpler. Take what the ground has given back to you. Keep people away from what still threatens to fall. Learn to live with an amphitheater that is now half a diagram and half a wall. At a human scale, the change brought a strange intimacy. Boys could climb to perches that had never been visible before and look straight through the carcass to the city beyond. A traveler coming up from the Forum could watch sunset flare through openings that once had held shadow. A mason could set his hand on a cut face that had not seen air since Vespasian's time and feel the cool of old work. The Colosseum was no longer a shell that enclosed the city for a spectacle. It had become a frame through which the city watched itself grow older. Archaeology confirms the chain of cause and effect that people felt in their bones. In the fallen zones, the pattern of break shows failure along the joints where iron clamps once had been. In the surviving arcs, one sees the old lead-packed sockets where iron still holds. The differential settlement between the north and the south is legible in the geometry of the remaining arches. The tilt is slight to the eye but measurable, and it tells the same story that the chronicles tell. The arena was always a compromise with water and soil, a compromise managed brilliantly in the 1st century and then tested by time. When the test came in 1349, one half bent and kept its poise, and one half did not. The fall of the south side is therefore both event and lesson. It is an event that gave the monument its modern face, the one by which generations have known it in drawings, prints, and photographs. It is a lesson in the life of great works. They endure not by magic, but by proportion, by maintenance, and by the accidents of ground and weather. When any part of that triad fails, even Rome's greatest amphitheater must yield. The city gathered up the stones and carried them into new churches and palaces. The standing half remained to teach and to warn. In the gap, the story of the missing part began to speak with an eloquence that required no words. If the earthquake of 1349 tore the southern hem from the amphitheater, the following centuries taught Rome how to wear what remained. The missing part did not vanish. It traveled. It moved on wagons through gates and along narrow streets. It was stacked in courtyards and hoisted by cranes, planed and dressed and mortared into new alignments. To walk through 15th and 17th century Rome is to walk among the Colosseum's scattered bones. The traffic began with what lay at hand. Fallen blocks from the south side sat like quarried stock already cut to rule. Licenses allowed carters and masons to haul what gravity had given. The city's registers show a vocabulary that becomes routine. Carts, oxen, rope, wedges, tally, seal. Lime burners set their kilns in bays of the outer ring where draft and cover could be had in the same place. Marble revetments and stair facings that had endured centuries were broken and fed to domed ovens until they gave up the white powder that bound a new Rome together. The fire left rings of soot on the vault crowns that archaeologists still read like signatures. As the habit matured, it was organized by office. The commune auctioned removal rights. Later, the papal chamber issued formal permissions, a stamp of authority given in exchange for fees. The new language of urban ambition spoke in these documents. The amphitheater appears as a ledger entry, a source of travertine for bridges and palaces, for churches and embankments that would protect the Tiber's flanks. Under Nicholas V, the traffic reached an industrial scale. Records from his short but energetic reign speak of thousands of cartloads taken from the ruin to feed projects that announced a reborn capital. Foundations were laid, walls were faced. The Vatican district took on substance where there had been modest houses and lanes. The routes themselves became part of the city's memory. Carters led oxen from the southern precinct across the valley and up toward building yards on the Quirinal and the Capitoline. Others turned toward the Borgo, the neighborhood that climbed toward St. Peter where projects multiplied. A single travertine block could become many things. A lintel for a palace window, a stair for a chapel, a plinth beneath a saint. Chisel marks from the Flavian age were shaved away. New drafts were cut to match Michelangelo's taste or that of lesser masters who measured their dreams against ancient strength. Families who had made a fortress of the amphitheater now made investments with its stone. The Frangipani and their rivals had once strung chains across the ring passages and barred gates against cousins. Their heirs sold access and took rents from bays used as workshops. Money flowed to palaces that were themselves made from ancient spoil. Visitors admired a rusticated base on a noble residence without knowing that the block had once carried a Roman senator up a stair to his seat. The amphitheater's dignity was dismantled and reassembled as the dignity of a new elite. Not every scheme was a quarry permit. Some popes imagined a wholesale conversion. Sixtus V, the energetic builder who liked straight roads and strong statements, proposed to turn the amphitheater into a manufactory that would employ Rome's poorest women at wool and cloth. He talked of flooring the ellipse, of cutting workrooms into the arcades, of harnessing a monument that stood for pagan excess to a program of Christian order and charity. The plan died with him, but its audacity reveals how the ruin was understood. It was a tool waiting for a user, not a relic under glass. The balance between scavenging and sanctifying shifted over time, rather than in a moment. Small chapels were tended inside the arks. Modest processions circled the interior with prayers for the dead, an echo of a belief that the place had soaked up martyrdom even if the arithmetic of martyrdom remained uncertain. At the same time, kilns smoked. Men with iron bars pried at clamps set in lead in the old days, loosening the ties that had held piers in tension. Each clamp taken left a rectangular scar on the travertine's face that one still sees as a pattern of wounds. Those sockets tell a plain story. The Colosseum was unmade as much by need as by disaster. The southern quadrant gave readily because the ground beneath it was treacherous and because the fall of 1349 had cracked spines and loosened joints. The northern flank resisted. Its arches were better seated and more watched. The result was the outline known to every traveler since the age of engravers, a broken half facing a whole half, a jagged cross-section behind a surviving facade. Prints by Piranesi in the 18th century would make a romance of that contrast. But long before his copper plates bit acid, common workers had learned to read the ruin by its profile. South meant salvage. North meant caution. The economy of dismantling generated its own trades and its own literature. There were guides who knew which bays held blocks large enough to reward the risk of a shift in a pier. There were guards who closed off arches when a fall had made a passage too dangerous. There were clerks who counted carts and set a price per axle as they rolled through gates. A proverb arose that scolded a 17th century papal family for greed. What the barbarians had not done, the Barberini had done. The jibe aimed at bronze taken from the Pantheon for the great canopy in St. Peter. It also captured a mood. The city had developed a taste for building with the flesh of its ancestors. The Colosseum felt that appetite like a long fever. Travelers did not always understand what they were seeing. Some wrote that St. Peter had been raised from the amphitheater's stones. The truth is simpler and more tangled. New quarries at Tivoli supplied travertine in quantity for the grandest works. But Colosseum stone also found its way into the fabric of many projects, especially foundations and repairs where provenance did not trouble the conscience. Palaces on the Quirinal and near the Piazza Venezia wore blocks that had stood in the arena's arcades. Bridges over the Tiber were patched with stone that remembered gladiators and saffron spray. A city built from layers became more layered still. Archaeology confirms what account books suggest. Lime kilns have been found within the precinct, their circular footprints clear against ancient pavements. Bays still show blocking walls of rough ashlar, medieval and early modern partitions that made rooms for tenants. Tool marks on certain fallen blocks reveal recutting to standard modules used in early Renaissance palaces. Lead residues cling in sockets where clamps once tied rows together, testament to 1,000 quick heats that gave the metal back to foundries. In places, one can see where a large block was split with wooden wedges that were soaked, so that swelling forced the stone to part along a drilled line. These are the fingerprints of the craft that unmade the structure. There is a moral dialectic in this period that a historian must observe with care. On the one hand, the dismantling gave the city fabric that it needed. Rome had suffered depopulation and wanted vigor. The new palaces housed offices and courts. New churches anchored parishes. Embankments and bridges protected lives. The stones taken from the amphitheater can be counted as gifts forward. On the other hand, the loss altered more than a wall. It changed a memory. When a citizen walked past the broken side and looked through to the forum, he saw a symbol of an old power, humbled and distributed. For some, that distribution was piety, a pagan thing giving its mass to a Christian city. For others, it was waste, a failure to guard a witness to the craftsmanship of the First Empire. Stories attach to individual pieces as they do to relics. A stair in a palace on a hill creaks, and an old porter tells a visitor that it once lay in the amphitheater. A mason takes pride that a window frame he set surrounds a view that in a previous life was a run of arches seen by Titus. A priest rests his hand on a plinth in a side chapel and thinks of the day the cart arrived from the old valley and the parish boys watched with wide eyes as something colossal was eased through a narrow door. Fact and sentiment intermingle, and out of that mixture grows the city's lived sense of its past. The idea of arresting the ruins' depletion came in time, driven by a new reverence for antiquity and by a pastoral desire to turn a site of remembered cruelty into a place of contrition. By the middle of the 18th century, a pope would declare the structure sacred and forbid the removal of stone, would set stations of the cross within the arcades, and would encourage pious processions to reclaim the place with prayer. Before that decree, the habit of spolia had run for centuries. The missing part of the Colosseum had already been spread across the hills in 1,000 specific ways that could not be undone. To say the bones were scattered is to say that the Colosseum did not simply die, it reincarnated. It became cornice and curb, threshold and stair, pier and paving. In the city that claims eternity, survival often means transformation. The amphitheater was a master of that art. It learned to persist by serving projects that were not its own. It learned to speak through the mouths of new facades. Its absence became a kind of presence, instructing visitors that empires are not only toppled by enemies, they are also edited by descendants who need a roof and a wall. By the 18th century, the Colosseum had become the most eloquent ruin in Europe. Painters and poets arrived with sketchbooks and notebooks, climbed the broken stairs, and looked through its ribs at the city beyond. Engravers made its profile a currency of awe. Giovanni Battista Piranesi etched the arcades so that every crack and butt joint caught the light. Grand tour travelers carried home portfolios that made the amphitheater a lesson in the sympathy between collapse and memory. To preserve such a thing required a new idea, not restoration to a lost whole, but the care of a fragment that had learned how to speak. The first decisive guardian came from the papal court. In the mid-1700s, Pope Benedict XIV declared the Colosseum a sacred place. He set the Stations of the Cross around its interior and urged Romans to treat the arena as a memorial to the martyrs. Scholars can argue the arithmetic of martyrdom, yet the pastoral policy worked in a practical way. It arrested the long habit of quarrying the ruins. Licenses to cart away blocks dried up. Kilns that had burned marble for lime were closed. A ruin that had supplied palaces and churches now began to supply a different comfort. Processions walked the oval in penitential seasons. The battered stones received prayer instead of chisels. Attention soon turned from sanctity to structure. Serious cracks ran through the surviving ring, and the open southern side admitted wind and rain that worried every vault. Surveyors paced the corridors and tapped the arches. Architects drew plans and sections of the whole. The first great interventions of the 19th century read like a grammar of rescue. Piers were banded where fissures had opened. Vaults were needled with brick to relieve thrust. At the northwest curve, a massive brick buttress was added to counter the outward push of the surviving tiers. On the southern flank, another great buttress followed a generation later. They framed the ruin like bookends, a quiet admission that the amphitheater would remain incomplete, but would be kept standing. The new work came with a philosophy. Builders were instructed to distinguish their brick and mortar from the Flavian travertine. Where they closed a gap or bridged a wound, they did not pretend to be ancient. The contrast taught visitors how to read the wall. Original courses are tight and pale. Later stitches are deeper red and follow different joints. The ruin wore its repairs like scars, honestly won. This ethic answered a debate that was lively in Europe. Some urged bold reconstructions to show the building as it had been. Others argued for romantic neglect. Rome chose a third course. Stabilize and reveal. Buttress what must be held. Remove what confuses the story. Then leave the rest to time. Archaeology took the stage under the new regime. For centuries, the arena had been filled with earth and gardens. Excavators cleared the center and reopened the hypogeum, the underworld of corridors, cages, and lifts that once brought animals and scenery to the light in a heartbeat. Visitors who had known only the ellipse as a hollow shell now learned to read it as a machine. The line of the parapet that had defended the spectators could be traced along the inner ring. The radial walls that carried the tiers up to the sky could be followed step by step. The geometry of crowd management became visible again. In the galleries, inscriptions emerged from dust. Painted numbers over arched doorways explained how an ancient citizen had found his seat. Even the weeds won a chapter. In the middle of the 19th century, a British physician named Richard Deakin walked the tiers and catalogued the plants that had taken root in joints and seams. He counted hundreds of species and wrote a small book on the flora of the Colosseum. Seeds had blown in from North Africa and the Levant, carried by birds and by the baggage of travelers. The arena had become an accidental botanical garden, a living record of the empire's old geography. The catalogue charmed scholars who loved such minglings of nature and history. It also served a practical turn. Gardeners and masons learned which plants most threatened mortar and which could be tolerated for their delicate bloom. The 19th century brought new owners and new uses. After the unification of Italy, the monument passed from the papal state to the new nation. Engineers in uniform now shared the keys with archaeologists. Military bands played at civic ceremonies in the shadow of the arcades. The interior hosted displays that taught citizens to think of Rome as a capital again. There were debates about whether to recover the arena floor to stage modern spectacles. There were arguments for leaving the hypogeum open as a permanent lesson. The argument for truth prevailed. The underworld remained bare, a map in brick and tufa that told a quieter but more exact story about the Roman talent for staging surprise. The 20th century added another layer of preservation and of rhetoric. The modern city crowded close. New streets and the traffic of engines sent vibrations through old work that had been designed for footfalls and cart wheels. Authorities closed passages, installed lighting, and laid railings for safer circulation. Excavations carried the clearance of the arena deeper and linked the Colosseum to the Forum, with pathways that taught a continuous history from Republican temples to Flavian arches. The state used the ruin in pageantry and in pedagogy. Film crews learned to move through the galleries without touching the walls. School groups learned to listen for the difference between old stone and new brick beneath the palm of a hand. One tradition from the 18th century found a modern voice. The Way of the Cross at the Colosseum became a Good Friday ritual again, televised to the world, so that the ruin's new identity as a place of memory was carried far beyond Rome. Candles moved like a slow river along the oval. Prayers rose where roars had once risen. The transformation of meaning was complete and yet modest. No one pretended that the amphitheater had been built for saints. The point was to let the stones stand and to let their history be told without shame or nostalgia. Conservation in the late 20th and early 21st centuries learned to speak the language of science. Teams mapped microcracks and monitored strain. Laser surveys captured the curve of every arch for comparison after a frost or a tremor. Gentle cleaning lifted the soot of centuries from selected surfaces so that the color of the stone could be read again without bleaching its age. Loose fragments were catalogued and stored so that repairs would have material that belonged to the fabric. Some modern campaigns drew private funding and public debate. The sum of them kept the ruins stable while improving the way the public moved through its spaces. The work of preservation has always included a study of restraint. When to stop is as important as where to begin. The great buttresses remain, but no one proposes to add more. The hypogeum is open to view, but no one speaks seriously of flooding the arena to test an ancient rumor. The exterior is cleaned lightly, but ivy is allowed to keep a little of its hold, so that the ruin does not lose the depth that time gives. The Colosseum teaches its keepers as surely as they teach schoolchildren. It asks that we accept loss as part of the story, and that we care for what remains with patience. The result is a paradox that would have pleased the ancients. The most carefully tended building in Rome is a ruin. It is protected by law and by piety. It is measured by engineers and sketched by tourists. It lives in the imagination as a fragment and as a whole at once. The missing part has become a feature, not a wound to be concealed. It is the aperture through which modern eyes see the interior logic of the structure. It is the space through which the city and the centuries speak to each other. Stand before the Colosseum at first light, and the absence tells the story before any guide speaks. The southern side is open to the sky. Through that great wound, the city passes like a river of time. In the 1st century, it framed imperial power. In the 2nd, it framed a program of spectacle. In the 3rd and 5th, it framed fire and tremor and repair. In the Middle Ages, it framed survival. In the Renaissance, it framed the invention of a new Rome out of the quarry of the old. The missing part is therefore not only a loss, it is a lens. It lets us see the structure, the city, and ourselves. Medieval pilgrims had already sensed this metaphoric power. The proverb long attributed to a venerable English monk held that while the Colosseum stands, Rome stands, and when it falls, Rome and the world will fall. The line married the permanence of stone to the fate of cities. Yet permanence was never the true lesson here. The amphitheater endured because it changed. It accepted gardens and graves, markets and fortresses, chapels and kilns. Its stones moved into palaces and churches. Its profile shifted after earthquakes. The gap that opens to the south is the record of that truth. It is the negative space left by centuries of barter between memory and need. In the 18th century, the ruin became a school for the eye. Piranesi gave Europe an image of the Colosseum that was both exact and theatrical. Every joint and crack is etched with a craftsman's attention. Travelers on the Grand Tour climbed the remaining tiers and learned to love what time had done. They stopped measuring perfection and began to measure eloquence. The missing part helped this conversion. A whole amphitheater might have tempted a restorer's pride. A half amphitheater demanded a different virtue, the willingness to admire a fragment that still ruled a skyline. Religion deepened the metaphor. When a pope set the Stations of the Cross within the arcades and forbade further quarrying, he did more than protect stone. He reversed the moral current of the place. Where crowds had once roared at punishments, penitents now walked and prayed. The broken ring became an arena of a different kind. A theater of contrition that did not erase the past but placed it inside a new ritual. In our own century, this habit has taken on a public voice. Each year, Rome lights the Colosseum in honor of cities that renounce executions or commute a sentence. The same walls that had witnessed the craft of death are now used to speak for life. The metaphor is not subtle, and that is its strength. Nationalism tried to draft the ruin into its service and taught another lesson in the process. In the years after Italian unification, the amphitheater became the capital's emblem. Banners and bands ringed its arcades. School children were brought to learn their history by walking from Republican temples to Flavian arches, and then to Renaissance palaces that wore ancient stone. Later, in the 20th century, a new regime sought to claim the Colosseum and its surroundings as a stage for modern power. Old neighborhoods were cleared, straight roads were cut, and processions of uniforms moved where bakers and cobblers had lived. The amphitheater did not change its shape for this program. It kept its silence and its broken rim. The very stubbornness of the ruin resisted ownership. Governments pass. The ellipse remains, unpersuaded, too old for slogans. Archaeology turned the metaphor into a craft. When the Hypogeum was cleared in the 19th and 20th centuries, and again in our time, the missing half allowed visitors to read the building as a device. One sees how crowds were guided by numbered arches, how the maze of corridors distributed rank, how the lifts rose to deliver a leopard or a stage tree at the strike of a cue. Engineers now bring students to learn from joints and thrusts that have worked for 2 millennia. The gap is the cross-section of a lesson. It shows how an oval became a machine with nerves and veins designed to move living bodies through shock and delight. Science also studies the absence. Conservators map microfractures that creep along edges, opened when the south side fell. Monitors track strain through seasons of heat and cold. Botanists still note the stubborn flora that finds purchase in joints. Seeds from North Africa and the Levant ride on bird wings and settle, a faint echo of the empire's old geography, a living map sustained by mortar and Sunday. The missing part is a laboratory wall where time writes its formulas. Tourists give the metaphor its modern crowded life. They stand where senators once sat and look through the broken side toward the Forum and the line of the old processional way. They carry away the same double impression that touched travelers 2 centuries ago. The amphitheater is enormous, and it is incomplete. It is an emblem of mastery, and it is a confession of loss. Guides point out the pockmarks where iron clamps were robbed, and a child runs a finger over the scar and understands that history can be touched. A family passes a bronze plaque that marks the path of the Good Friday rite and understands that meaning can be changed without lies. The stones that left the amphitheater continue to speak within their new walls. A stair in a palace on a hill bears the weight of diplomats and remembers the pressure of a Roman crowd. A church cornice catches evening light with the same creamy glow as the surviving arcades. Bridges over the Tiber wear blocks that once kept rhythm in a gallery. The city is a chorus, and the Colosseum is the bass line that sounds even when it is not visible. The missing part was not discarded. It was redistributed into 1,000 useful shapes. That is not an elegy. It is a civic economy written in stone. Writers have used the ruin as a figure for mortality. and they are not wrong. But there is another reading worth keeping. The Colosseum is also a figure for repair. From the 3rd century forward, this building has taught that care is not a single act. It is a sequence of choices made by many hands. Some choices were misguided, some were ruthless, some were wise. Together they made a monument that tells its history in layers. The gap is part of that lesson. A fracture can reveal structure as clearly as a plan drawn in ink. In an age that dreams of perfect restoration, the Colosseum argues for honest memory. The amphitheater's symbolic reach has grown as its physical reach has shrunk. It is on coins of the modern state and on the covers of guidebooks that sell the first dream of Rome to a traveler. It frames liturgies that are broadcast to many countries and protests that carry messages far beyond Italy. It is an image used by conservationists to raise funds and by teachers to explain empire and urbanism. It says, without any need for translation, that power is grand and that time is patient. It says that cities are made from compromises between glory and need. It says that what is taken away can still belong. The missing part, therefore, resolves the narrative that began with Vespasian's decision to drain a private lake and give the center back to the people. The Colosseum fulfilled that decision in ways he could not have imagined. It became a forum of death and law. It became a medieval market and a fortress. It became a quarry and a reliquary. It became a romantic school and a national emblem. Today, it is a carefully kept ruin, a shrine that honors endurance, and a classroom that rewards attention. Its absence is its final gift. Through the opening, the city sees what it has been, and we see what the city has chosen to keep.